Welcome to today's Mind, Body and Relationship Maze. I'm Tom Mackay.
And I'm Angela Dirks.
And today we're going to be talking about those things that wind you up when your partner does them.
Yeah, so all these sort of irritating little habits, for example, like somebody who's eating very loudly or a partner who's snoring every night. So these are just some examples of the kind of things that might really irritate you about your partner.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's those things that, when you first meet your partner, they may do things that sometimes initially you find cute or you find kind of like adorable as little kind of quirks, but over time they gradually become irritating. It's like those things that at first, when you got those rose-coloured lenses on, even when, if your partner squeezes the toothpaste in the middle of a tube, you think, oh, that's kind of sweet. And then as the months go by, things change and gradually it becomes a little bit annoying. And if that builds up too much, it gets to the point where we're thinking like, I just can't take it anymore if they do that.
Sort out that toothpaste.
Yeah.
Yes, because of course in the beginning stages of the relationship, you're very focused on building the relationship, and everything, as Tom just said, everything that your partner does is absolutely wonderful and adorable. So the intention is quite different at the beginning, isn't it? It's all about building, it's all about liking each other, it's all about focusing on what you love about each other, and as you said, what's adorable, what's great about each other. So that's the kind of honeymoon phase of the relationship, and that starts to shift after some time. So the honeymoon phase can last anything from 6 months to 2 years, but then there will be a shift gradually when you're moving into a different stage. Some people call it the chasm. Then there's the power struggle. So that's the kind of stage when you start to see the first kind of cracks in your partner. So they're not quite as wonderful anymore, and the toothpaste thing is really going to wind you up. You think, actually, there's stuff here that I don't like. I didn't quite notice that in the same way before. And you might even wonder, this is the sort of stage where, is this the right partner for me? Can we really live together? So that this is a really interesting, it's a fork in the road for lots of relationships about, are we going to continue with this or are we going to break up?
Yeah, and at those beginning stages of relationship as well, we sometimes find these things that may be kind of slightly quirky, these things that later we get irritated by. We may find them kind of like cute initially, and part of that is actually because our brain's also flooded with these sort of happy chemicals.
Absolutely.
So we have more endorphins flowing around the system. We have it's oxytocin, is that right?
Oxytocin.
Yeah, so it makes us kind of see these things in a much better way. But when that fades, and it does fade,
yes,
then we have to find a way of dealing with it. And what can happen is if we don't learn a way of dealing with these things or address them, they really can build up.
Yeah.
It can build up to a point where it can really cause problems in a relationship where we continue getting irritated by our partner. Yeah.
Because the interpretation then is different as well. Whereas at the beginning, I'm going to stick with this toothpaste example. At the beginning is that at the beginning of the relationship, you think, well, actually, this is, my partner is not intentionally doing it. They might be just thoughtless, and therefore you can shrug it off. Whereas later on, when you are further down the line of the relationship, you might ascribe a different intention to this kind of presentation. You might actually think, well, they're doing it to annoy me, or they're doing it because they're not respecting my opinion on this. So it creates there's a different way of looking at it, and not necessarily always a positive interpretation.
Yeah, and just as Angela said, I mean, that's the key thing is, initially we may think that, when we start to get annoyed with them, we may think they're doing it on purpose. And that's one of the first things that we want to kind of address is, first of all, is if we want to find a way through this, one of the first things we might want to do is think, well, is our partner really aware of it? Because the chances are that they're not necessarily. Yeah. So it might be that squeezing a toothpaste from the middle of a tube, they've never realised that that could annoy people.
Absolutely.
Like, when I grew up, there were certain things that I never knew, like because my parents would never say things when I was at home, and maybe they did things, and it's like things like squeezing. I think I used to squeeze toothpaste from the middle of a tube. Maybe I still do. I'm not sure.
Yeah. It wouldn't bother me. So.
Yeah. There's other things, all sorts of things like, and it's little things like putting the loo seat down if you're a man, things that we may not be aware of. I know many men who have never realised that could annoy their partner.
Yes.
So, things like that bringing to awareness is one of the first things, because essentially in a relationship, it's great, I think, to want to do things to help your partner be happy.
Yes.
Within limits, of course. I think the limits are in terms of we want to make sure that we're happy and our partner's happy, but we do want to think of, there are some things we can change, which they're not such a big deal. And when we're aware that they may annoy our partner, then I think, sometimes those things are great to work on for ourselves.
Absolutely. So it might be really helpful, actually, for your partner to know that this is something that's irritating you. Because as Tom just said, they might not be aware of it, they might not notice that this is something that's winding you up. So if it's not being discussed, if it's kind of just festering and building some resentment, well, nothing's going to change about it, right? So it does need to be addressed, obviously. And also, I think one of the starting points in these kind of discussions is to always kind of ascribe good intentions to your partner, to assume that your partner is not doing it intentionally to wind you up, but they're doing it because they're not aware of it. And to assume that when you do start a conversation about it, that there is a willingness to actually change it.
Yeah, and I think also putting boundaries around this as well. It's also being aware, is it that we get wound up by every tiny thing? Because, we need to be careful about where our wanting to change partner becomes controlling as well. I think, those boundaries with toxic sort of behavior where, if it's really every single thing, like, well, I get annoyed when my partner kind of wears their kind of t-shirts a little bit too much, showing too much shoulder, these, if we're annoyed by every tiny thing, that can be, potentially damaging, things like, I get annoyed, I find it annoying when my partner's speaking too much to my friends and I get a chance to, these are things where it could be controlling. But when it's things like, for example, my partner's chewing the food too loudly, or opens their mouth when they're eating, or kind of speaking as their mouth's full. I mean, these are things that we think, well, is this a behaviour that other people would find annoying? Is this a behaviour that, on the whole, could be seen annoying by other people, or is it just me?
Yeah. Absolutely. So it's a fine line. Well, it's not such a fine line. I think it's actually quite clear about whether the behaviour sort of becomes controlling in that sense, where you're trying to criticize everything that your partner's doing, and you're trying to shape your partner, so to speak, or you're not actually accepting them for who they are, but you're trying to turn them into someone else. That's another level, isn't it? That's different from sort of the odd, particular presentations of your partner that you find irritating.
Yeah, and and although there are things as well where we do need flexibility, because I think we want to be the best partner we can be for our partner as well, without changing who we are. I think that's the key.
Yes.
But there are things that we need to be flexible on, like if our partner really wants to go for a walk with us and we never do, or are never kind of willing to do that, we never find the time. Those things essentially, that's not going to change who we are, but it's finding ways that we can do things together with our partner as well, and little things that we can change that essentially, aren't fundamentally going to change who we feel we are.
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's also an expression of love and care, isn't it? It's showing that I really care for you. I'd like to do something that I think really matters to you. So absolutely, so it's really important to do that.
Yeah, and I think then what we think is, well, are there solutions? Is it under our control? Because there's some things that maybe we can't control. Things like snoring are more difficult to control. So, these may be things that are tricky. So it may be things that we need to find a way to deal with if our partner does that, whether it's earplugs or whatever it happens to be. Although, there may be things that we can do to try to change that. Right?
Sure.
Yeah. So we may kind of find there's nasal strips and other things that may help us stop snoring. So we do what we can as well within that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just trying to find, it is about trying to come to some common solutions on it, really. As always, it's about communication. It's about sitting down and having a conversation about it and deciding what can we do together here so that we're both comfortable in this relationship.
Yeah, and if obviously if it's things like, well, I don't like the fact that you're kind of 5'5", I wish you were taller. Those are things that we probably can't do too much about. So, and those are things that, for the person that's getting annoyed about, that's things that we need to deal with. But those things that we can have control over, well, it's first of all bringing them to awareness. And I think one of the first keys is when we want to bring them to the other person's awareness is bring these things up at a time when we're not feeling overly emotional. So if it's at a time that you're actually feeling annoyed, there's a chance that we're going to say it with too much emotion and the other person is going to get defensive. So find a time where you both can have time to listen to each other. You're not going to be kind of affected by the emotions at the time. And you can just, quite matter of fact, just kind of describe what's going on.
Yeah. In relatively neutral terms. So being quite straight about it as well and not talk around it. Because sometimes I think what people do is they're not very clear about what it is that they're asking for. So it's really important to also communicate very clearly what it is that you experience. Yeah. So start with I statements. I feel when you do this, I feel this. To kind of get that across and be really clear about this is what's going on for me. So that there's no ambiguity for the partner either, that they're really clear about this is what is the issue here that needs addressing.
Yeah, and sometimes quite matter of fact. I mean, even things like we were talking about, the other person may not have noticed. So it's sort of, you know, I'm just wondering if you've ever noticed that sometimes when we're having dinner and you're talking that, you know, food is spilling out of your mouth. So things the other person may not be aware of. And there are other things like you said that we might say, well, yeah, I often feel disrespected when you're using your phone when we're having a conversation.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, you know, are you aware of that? Yeah. Are you aware of what was going on?
Absolutely, yeah.
And then finding a way to, like, thinking, well, you know, can we find a solution? Can we find a way forwards? Just so, because I really value the time with you and I'd like to feel that we're both kind of there for each other.
Yeah, so it's trying to find some sort of compromise. It's trying for the partner who's listening, who's at the receiving end of this conversation, to also think about what is it that I can do here? Is there something I can do here? Do I have control over this? What is it that I can do to make my partner happier in this regard or not? Yeah. And sometimes, I mean, obviously this can kind of spiral sometimes and it can lead to other issues if there's a whole pile of stuff that you're sitting on that hasn't been resolved previously. And often this is the case, isn't it? That, you know, somebody makes a complaint about loud eating, the other one responds and says, but you always do this. And then the whole thing kind of spirals out of control and becomes a kind of tit for tat. So it is also really kind of, as you say, Tom, just finding the right moment to address this and to be really clear that you're only talking about this and not lots of other things. If there are lots of other things that need addressing, then that can be addressed on another occasion and separately from this particular issue.
Yeah, and starting with those words, like Angela was saying, such as, I feel X when this happens, is a great way of doing it. Because when somebody's saying, well, you know, I feel upset or I feel kind of disrespected, you know, immediately they're expressing how they're feeling. We don't want the person to feel that way. Whereas what we want to avoid is name calling, blame, you know, sort of things like, you know, you just don't pay any attention to me. If I say, you know, if I start with something like that, or you know, you're such a disgusting eater, you know, or whatever it happens to be, then immediately we go on defensive. So starting by saying how we feel, and then expressing what the behaviour is in matter of fact terms, without any blame, any labelling, any judgment, because like we talked about, the other person may not be aware of it, and that's the best way to move forwards with this.
Absolutely. Well, and I think also there's an underlying issue here around what are your expectations from a relationship. I mean, it's also kind of accepting that you're not going to find everything perfect about your partner. Well, you can find them almost perfect, yeah, but there will be something that's niggling, and that's entirely normal to sort of to really adjust to the fact that there might be something that your partner does differently, they think differently, they feel differently, etc. So it's sort of also taking this into account that there is this is likely to play out in any relationship. There will always be something that you would do differently or that might be slightly irritating to you.
Absolutely. So, you know, knowing that when you get into a relationship, however amazing that person seems, there's going to be times in the future where you start to get annoyed by things. But these are things that you can address, and also things that we can work on ourselves when we do things that we're not aware of.
Yeah.
And it's great. It's a sense of learning and moving forwards and developing ourselves as well when we become aware of those things.
Absolutely. So there's an opportunity here. So I think key is what we want you to take away from the podcast today is that it's really important to kind of address these things as they arise as quickly as possible, to not sit on them for too long. Because if they all build up, if they fester over a long period of time, there might be some resentment that's building up. And then when you do sit down and have this conversation, a sort of bomb goes off and all sorts of stuff comes out of Pandora's box, right? And gets put on the table, and it gets too overwhelming, and then nothing gets resolved. So do try to address it as and when it arises with your partner as soon as possible, and when you're not too distressed by it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually brought to my mind a film I saw years and years ago, The War of the Roses, where it was, you'd have to look it up. It's where there's a couple, when they meet, they're so in love and so attracted to each other, then gradually we get annoyed by little things that become bigger and bigger. So it's essentially, they end up really at war with each other completely. So I think the general rule is, as an expression I've heard before, is deal with the monster while it's tiny, before it becomes out of control.
I've not heard that before, but that's very apt. Absolutely. Good.
Great. Well, to find out more ways that you can improve your relationship, or even to find ways that you can help to find a relationship if you haven't got a relationship that you want yet, please head over to therelationshipmaze.com, where we've got lots more information to help you find and create the relationship that you deserve.
Absolutely. We're looking at the different stages of relationships. We're looking at addressing conflict. We are getting you to reflect on yourself and think about who you are as a person and what you bring into the relationship, and and also how to communicate effectively with your partner.
Yeah, and if you like this podcast, please write us a review and also share it and subscribe so that you can tune into the next episode. And we look forward to talking to you then.